Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Josh Altic. I'm the Ballot Measures Project Director for Ballotpedia. And then also on the call is Ryan Byrne, who's one of our great staff writers who writes a lot of the articles about statewide ballot measures. So thank you for joining us for this, I guess our first or second webinar in a series of webinars where we're going to be talking about the sort of notable trends and significant topics that are on the ballot in 2018 in the statewide ballot measure world. So this webinar is on redistricting, and there are 6 ballot measures in 5 states featured in 2018. One of those was already on the ballot in Ohio in May. So looking just at November, you've got 4 states that'll be deciding on a change to the redistricting process for either congressional districts, state legislative districts, or both in most cases. So yeah, we'll be walking through the details of each of these measures and then looking at sort of some context, and I hope it's helpful. And then there'll be a question and answer period at the end. So looking at 2018 redistricting, there are 2 measures on the ballot in Colorado, Amendment Y and Amendment Z. Proposal 2 is on the ballot in Michigan, Amendment 1 in Missouri, Proposition 4 in Utah, and as I mentioned, Issue 1 passed in Ohio in May. There were some pretty concrete efforts that also happened in Arkansas and South Dakota. The South Dakota measure just failed by a couple thousand signatures to meet the threshold to be on the ballot. And the Arkansas measure is technically still pending for a future ballot, although they did not meet the signature deadline for 2018. So we're gonna walk through each of these measures and then sort of place them in the context of sort of the larger scheme historically, and then in 2018 specifically. So Colorado Amendments Y and Z, these were put on the ballot by a vote of the legislature, so they were not citizen initiatives. They were, however, sort of motivated by a compromise between 2 different groups that were both trying to sponsor sort of competing or very different initiatives to change the redistricting process. So they weren't directly put on the ballot by a citizen initiative, but they were, the fact that these are on the ballot definitely involves the initiative process. The votes in both chambers of the legislature were unanimous. The process here for Colorado would be separate commissions. So one commission for congressional redistricting and one for state legislative redistricting. They would both be 12 members, 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and 4 members that are not affiliated with any political party. Technically, it's 4 from the largest party and 4 from the second largest party. The process for selecting those involves a pool of applicants, a panel of former judges that would select from that pool. And then there would also be a pool selected by legislative leaders, and then ultimately it would be narrowed by lot. It would require 8 of 12 commissioners to approve a map, and at least 2 of the unaffiliated members would have to approve it. And then there's a process for Supreme Court review for the map in every case. Criteria for the maps are also dictated by the measures, which include a competitiveness feature, which we measured by past election results, and it would require maximized competitiveness, and it would also have some of the more traditional criteria like minimal divisions of counties and cities and contiguous district boundaries, things like that. The support committee, there's one committee that's sort of working jointly on Y and Z, and they've raised about $2.5 million so far. So that's what's happening in Colorado. Utah Proposition 4. This is a measure. It's a citizen initiative put on the ballot by an organization called Better Boundaries. It would be for both congressional and state legislative redistricting. So they needed about 113,000 signatures. They submitted about 190,000, and they met the threshold. It's worth noting that this is the only redistricting measure on the ballot that would amend the state statute rather than changing the Constitution. So this is a statutory change. Utah does not have a process for initiated constitutional amendments. So the other measures on the ballot in November would actually amend the Constitution. That's relevant because they're actually the opposition that has come up, the arguments that have been released kind of focus a little bit on saying that this measure is not constitutional. that there could be some sort of challenge to it in the future based on those arguments, and there hasn't been yet. They spent about 1.04 million on the petition drive, and that was a large portion of what they've raised so far. They've raised about 1.37 million. This has map criteria similar to Colorado. It doesn't have the criteria to maximize competitiveness, but it has rules such as minimizing division, contiguous districts, and it does explicitly prohibit any sort of benefit to a candidate or a party. Some polling showed that there's still a large number of undecided voters on this. It's from late August. So it's showing 52% support, 18% opposition, and a large number of undecided voters. The process for this one would be a 7-member commission. There would need to be a vote of 5 of the 7 members to approve a map. And there would be a Supreme Court review to make sure the map sort of met the criteria of the initiative. One member is appointed by the governor, and then members are appointed by legislative leadership from both parties. So the majority and minority leaders, and then 2 commission members would have to be unaffiliated with any party. And then with this one, because the Constitution does give the state legislature sort of control over redistricting, the legislature would be able to reject a map proposed by the commission, but they would have to replace it with a map that satisfied the criteria proposed by the initiative. So that's sort of the mechanism there. This measure has received a large portion of its contributions from the Action Now initiative, which we will talk about sort of later on when we talk about all of the initiatives as a whole. For the next measure, Michigan Proposal 2, I'm going to hand it over to Ryan Byrne to sort of walk through the details.
Great, thanks, Josh. So Michigan Proposal 2 would transfer the power to draw the state's congressional and state legislative districts from the state legislature, which currently is in charge of redistricting, to an independent redistricting commission. And this would be the first independent commission east of the Rockies. All the other states that employ independent commissions to draw congressional lines specifically are located in the Rocky Mountains or on the Pacific Coast. So currently, the legislature, like I said, is in charge of these boundaries. Last time these boundaries were crafted was 2011, when Republicans controlled the legislature and the governor's office. So Republicans had a trifecta in state government, and this trifecta has remained in place through 2018. Republicans still control the legislature and governor's office. The Independent Redistricting Commission that Proposal 2 would create would be composed of 13 members, 4 from the largest party in the legislature, 4 from the second largest party in the legislature. So those will likely be Republicans and Democrats, as well as 5 members that are independents or members of third parties. This process of selecting these committee members largely involves random selection from pools. The state majority and minority leaders will strike candidates that are randomly selected, leaving a smaller pool that then the Secretary of State once again randomly selects from. To pass a map, the commission would need a majority vote, so 7 members, 7 of the 13, provided that at least 2 members of each political party and 2 members that are unaffiliated with either party approve it. And if the commission fails to adopt the plan through majority vote, there's kind of a backup mechanism in which the commissioners would rank the plans in order to preference, so they would be using a ranking system, and the plan that receives the most points would be adopted, provided that at least 2 members of each political party and 2 members that are unaffiliated kind of rank one of these maps, the winning map, in their top half. So Proposal 2 would also create a number of criteria that need to be considered in order of priority, things that you traditionally think of when it comes to redistricting, like equal population, compliance with federal law, contiguousness. But the Michigan ballot initiative also includes kind of some more novel criteria, such as taking into consideration the state's demographic population and what the initiative describes as communities of shared historical, cultural, or economic interest. The Proposal 2 would also require the commission to take into account advantages and disadvantages to political parties as well as to incumbents. So currently, the campaign Voters Not Politicians, which is behind Proposal 2, has raised about $1.67 million. And like the Utah Measure Action Now initiative is the largest donor. We've had 2 polls come out on Proposal 2 since the beginning of September, and both are giving Proposal 2 a plurality of support, but a large percentage of those surveyed are still undecided, 31% in one poll and 20% in another. So now we can go on to Missouri. So Missouri Amendment 1 is actually, it's a really unique ballot initiative in comparison to the other ones. So Missouri Amendment 1 actually touches on multiple policies, not just redistricting, but we're going to talk about the redistricting provision in this webinar. But it also addresses policies that Clean Missouri, which is the PAC behind Amendment 1, says are related to state legislative ethics. So issues regarding state legislative campaign finance, lobbying, and public records. So currently in Missouri, the legislature is not responsible for redistricting its own boundaries. It actually involves 2 commissions, one that creates a state house map and one that creates a state senate map. So the members of these commissions are actually appointed by political party committees, so political officials. And to approve a state legislative map, the plan must win the support of 70% of the commissioners in order to be enacted. Amendment 1 creates this new position that doesn't exist in any other state in terms of the redistricting process, known as the state demographer. So the state demographer would actually draw these state legislative maps. And the state demographer would be selected from a pool of applicants with the state auditor, state Senate Majority Leader, and the state Senate Minority Leader involved in the selection process of narrowing down the eventual candidate. Kind of the qualifications for being a demographer would be set by the state auditor as well. So when the demographer is done crafting a map, the map is actually sent to these commissions that are already in existence. And the same rules for approval that exist now would still apply. So 70% of the commissioners would be needed to make any changes to the demographer's maps. But if the commissioners cannot agree, 70% of them cannot agree on what to do with the demographer's map, then the demographer's map becomes enacted. So these commissions may or may not be involved in the process, depending on whether 70% or more of the commissioners want to get involved in the process, or rather agree to get involved in the process in some way. Amendment 1 would also create a bunch of unique criteria for considering when developing state legislative maps, including what the Amendment 1 calls partisan fairness, as well as competitiveness. So partisan fairness would be defined as parties being able to translate their popular support into legislative representation. And competitiveness would be defined as parties' representation in the state legislature being similarly responsive to changes in the electorate's preferences. Amendment 1 includes a number of formulas for determining what exactly these mean. These formulas take into account things like the electoral performance of the 2 major parties in the 3 preceding elections for governor, U.S. senator, and president. And other criteria are taken into account as well, such as contiguousness, political subdivisions, and compactness. To date, Clean Missouri has raised over $3 million, $3.84 million, including $618,000 from Action Now initiative. Ohio Issue 1. So as Josh mentioned, Ohio Issue 1 was actually on the ballot earlier this year. It was on the ballot in May, and it received almost 75% of the electorate voted yes on it. So it passed pretty overwhelmingly. Issue 1 resulted from negotiations between Senate Republicans, Senate Democrats, and the leaders of a ballot initiative committee. So this ballot initiative committee, it was called Fair Districts, Fair Elections Coalition. It was in the process of collecting signatures to actually take the power to draw congressional districts out of the hands of the state legislature and into the hands of a committee that was actually created in 2015 to deal with state legislative districts. So that committee actually involved 7 members, and at least 2 of those members are from a minority party. But the legislature stepped in, it entered into negotiations, and it decided in this compromise bill to keep the power of congressional redistricting primarily with the state legislature, but with additional requirements involving bipartisan support. So this is also something that's very novel. No other state requires a certain percentage of legislators from each major party to agree on a plan, but Ohio Issue 1 does, or at least initially does. So you can see here there is a flow chart of kind of the procedures that Issue 1 set up. It starts in the General Assembly, the redistricting process, and the maps that are developed need to be approved by 60% of all members, including 50% of the 2 largest parties. So let's say Republicans and Democrats. So at least half of them in the legislature need to agree in order to enact a 10-year plan. If they fail, it does go to this commission that the ballot initiative would have required. But once again, if it fails there, then it goes back to the General Assembly where the partisan requirement kind of decreases. We still need a 60% vote of all members, but now we only need 1/3 vote of the 2 largest parties. And if that fails too, then the General Assembly only needs a simple majority vote, no bipartisan requirement, but the maps only last for 4 years. So if in 2011 they approve maps, but they can't come to any kind of bipartisan agreement, and it gets to this step 4 as it says on the flow chart, then in 4 years they will need to craft maps again. And so this measure will apply following the 2020 census. So here you can see kind of an overview of the congressional redistricting process in the U.S. states. In 37 states, congressional districts are primarily crafted by state legislatures. You can see that covers most of the U.S. Except for the West. In 4 states, which are in the West, there are independent commissions. Utah and Colorado could join in 2018. But so could Michigan. So Michigan, as you can see, would be kind of the first east of the Rockies. In 2 states, they utilize what are known as political commissions. So this map here describes the state legislative redistricting process. And once again, you can see most of the independent commissions are out west. Primarily state legislatures are involved in this process. In 7 states, there are what's known as political commissions, kind of like what we talked about in Missouri, where these commissions currently exist that are composed of members appointed by political party committees. If Missouri Amendment 1 passes, I think we might need a new color for Missouri because of this state demographer position. It would be very unique. Yeah, so that kind of covers an overview of where the various states are now in terms of what processes they're using. And now Josh will kind of give a larger overview of the campaign finances that we're seeing surrounding the ballot initiatives.
Yeah, we mentioned these numbers sort of in the slides themselves, but you can see a summary here. There's a joint committee for Colorado. This raised about $2.54 million. Their opposition committees have registered, but they haven't reported contributions, at least as of the most recent reportings we've processed. Utah, 1.9 million total. They spend about $1 million of that on signatures. Michigan, about 1.7 million. There's opposition committees registered. Once again, they haven't seen a lot of campaign finance activity there yet. You can see Missouri, 3.8 million, and likewise about $1 million on signatures. The Michigan initiative, there was not a huge amount spent on signatures. There's a small amount spent on verifying the signatures that were collected before submitting them, but there wasn't a large portion spent on the actual to hire a petition management company and collect signatures that we've identified. The top donor that stands out is the Action Now initiative, which is a top donor for all of the November measures that are on the ballot. The Action Now initiative is a project of the Laura and John Arnold Foundation and has sort of a laundry list of policies that it advocates for, and redistricting is one of them. So I wanted to kind of also look into just some resources on past redistricting measures. So if you're writing articles about these, we have a nice database of statewide ballot measures. So if you're looking for sort of history on these, you can go here. I'll show this page real quick. We have a page called Redistricting Measures on the Ballot. Most recently, measures to sort of change the redistricting process. You look at Amendment T in 2016 in South Dakota, which was defeated, and then we mentioned Ohio Issue 1, which is sort of playing a role. The commission that was created by Issue 1 in 2015 is playing a role in the 2018 initiative. But if we look at that page real quick, so this is our redistricting measures on the ballot page. You can kind of see just by scrolling through it by year that 2018 stands out with the number of states that are voting on these methods and the number of different measures you have. There are some measures that are about specific maps, like in Maine, there were some measures that were a yes or no vote on a specific map proposed in the redistricting process. But it's hard to find a year in which more states would be deciding on the actual process involved in redistricting. But there's a lot of useful content here, and this goes back as far as possible. So, I advocate looking at this page if you're trying to get some historical context. Yeah, for me the big takeaway is that there's something special about 2018. There's a spike in the number of measures concerning this issue. And then I wanted to mention too that sort of we're grouping these measures into this larger trend that we're seeing in 2018 of measures concerning election policy. So there's 21 measures across 20 different states that we've sort of identified as notable changes to policy concerning either redistricting, like the ones we've reviewed in this webinar, but also voting requirements, things like voter ID and registration access, ballot access, campaign finance, and ethics, and sort of the Missouri measure touched on most of those. If you're looking for an overview of this topic, a good place to go would be our overview of the 2018 ballot measures. And just by 2018 ballot measures, but the notable trend. So this is our page. The notable top 2018 are listed here, and I'll sort of expand this so we can see the group. So there's redistricting, which is issue, but then you can see there's the voter ID is on the ballot, term limits is on the ballot. There's a really interesting measure in Florida about the restoration of the ability to vote for felons. Registration access is an issue that's on the ballot. Michigan has another interesting initiative that would actually add certain voting policies to the state constitution. So yeah, it's worth taking a look at what other measures are being proposed concerning just elections policy in 2018. Yeah, and that's sort of the end of the content we have. I'd love to open it up for questions. So any questions you have, we answer now. And Ryan and I are available for interviews at any time if you're working on an article in the future and need a quote or some content. Make sure to reach out to us. But I'm going to open it up to questions.
Hello.
Cool. Yes, thank you. Yeah. What is your question for Josh and Ryan?
Yeah, I'm from Michigan, and one of our biggest questions has been from people I've talked to is we're talking about 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, 5 unaffiliated. How are these identified as Democrat, Republican, or unaffiliated?
Hi, Alan. I can answer that question. So people would identify themselves in the applications, I believe. I imagine they need to provide some kind of voter registration identification that the Secretary of State would already have to determine that they are Democrats, Republicans, or unaffiliated.
Okay, so that leads me to this question of if person A says they're Democrat, then someone is actually going to check to their voting record that they are Democrat, because we don't want people pretending to be some other party to get on the commission to skew it.
Okay, that's a good question. I'm not aware of what the exact process is, or if there is a process mandated in this proposal. I can definitely look into that, and if you provide us your email, I can get back to you on that.
Okay, yeah, that's sort of the thing that seems to people wonder, especially the unaffiliated. I've volunteered with campaigns, Republican mostly, but you cannot figure out with a divided country like this, are there independents left?
Yeah, so it would require people to be independents, but I think what you're getting at is that people may be affiliated as independents but kind of have partisan leanings, and this would not vet people for their partisan leanings.
So that's the problem I would see on the commission. If you don't know that they are true Democrat, Republican, unaffiliated, you could end up with the same kind of gerrymandering commission as Congress.
Yeah, the provision there too once the pool of applicants is decided, there is the selection process in which leaders are allowed to strike candidates. So that's sort of a point that I think is relevant there. But yeah,
I saw some leaders striking, but then I guess my last question would be: then is the final thing up to the Secretary of State, or by the time it gets to the Secretary of State, it's basically decided?
Yeah, so the Secretary of State randomly selects the final sample, or from the final sample, to serve on the commission. But as Josh said, there's an initial random selection of 60 applicants who are registered Democrats, 60 applicants who are registered Republicans, and 80 applicants who do not affiliate with either party. But then these go to the legislature, where legislative majority leaders and legislative minority leaders are permitted to strike applicants from pools.
Okay.
So this would add up to 20 strikes, because each of them is allowed 5 strikes. So that would strike 20 between the 4 leaders, and then that would leave a somewhat smaller pool to randomly select from.
Okay, now randomly select what, we're drawing names out of a hat? I don't understand that.
Yeah, so it would be by lot. I don't know if they would use a hat, but it's designated to be by lot.
Secretary of State level, they're choosing randomly.
Yes, they would do it by lot somehow.
Okay. All right, thank you very much.
Cool, thank you very much. We have another question here from Margaret. And you should be free to unmute yourself now to ask your question. Cool. Okay, we'll give you a second to figure out your mic situation. And we got another a statement here or question from Gary. He says, I'm in Ohio, and after supporting issue 1 in May, the LWV filed suit, and it came out with their own proposed congressional map yesterday. So I think that's an update to Ohio issue 1. Which I assume we'll follow up with on our page, correct, Josh, Ryan?
Yeah, it sounds like that lawsuit is related to the current congressional maps. I don't think it's directly related to issue 1, but because issue 1 will not affect maps until 2020. But yeah, I'll definitely look into that and pass it on to our redistricting policy expert as well.
Cool, thanks. And Margaret, it looks like you unmuted yourself if you want to ask your question.
Yes, there were 2 things I wanted to point out. That the National Democratic Redistricting Committee has just recently given the voters, not politicians, $250,000 for their campaign. And also I wanted to point out that the people, you know, there's a time limit. You cannot have worked in a elected position for 6 years before you get on this redistricting. But we do have several Democratic politicians who in the past were Democratic, but who have since declared themselves as independent. And the thinking is that they're trying to unbalance the number of people who are going in as independents. Any information on that?
So I am aware of the campaign finance contributions. I have not heard about any kind of conflict regarding the second point, but I can definitely look into that. So yes, the National Democratic Redistricting Commission has endorsed Michigan Proposal 2. They also endorsed Ohio Issue 1 back in May. I don't believe at this point the NDRC has endorsed any of the other ballot initiatives regarding redistricting. But yes, the ones in Ohio and the ones in Michigan, the organization has backed.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We have gone a bit over time, so we're going to wrap things up. Again, if you have any questions, you can always email us at editor@ballotpedia.org. And then